Welcome to Conversations with Ex-Catholics. I am Kevin Non-Tradicath, and I am here today with Anonymous. Anonymous, I know because we exchanged a little bit of back and forth over email that at one point you were an SSPX seminarian, and I also know that you've been involved with the traditionalist movement for 31 years. You're not super involved with the traditionalist movement today, though you still identify in some ways as like culturally Catholic. We have a lot to get to. So I want you to take me back to the beginning and spend as much or as little time here as you want. But how did you get introduced to the traditionalist movement?
Well, I should clarify that I actually sing in a Gregorian chant school right now, so I guess I am sort of involved, but
Okay.
I don't identify as a Catholic like personally, but I don't necessarily advertise that to the like as far as they're concerned, like I pray all the prayers with them. I obviously sing with them and stuff like that, but I don't take communion. I haven't really taken Holy Communion since I got married. It was like over a dozen years.
Okay.
So
Okay.
I sort of officially excommunicated myself, even though I've not really left the church officially. Like I've been attending mass on and off this whole time. But
Okay.
yeah, I'll just start at the beginning. So I was born to a family of Mexican migrant workers in California, and we were obviously Catholics. I had a very rough, rough sort of childhood. So my grandparents were actually charismatics on my mom's side, and my on my dad's side, she was a bit of a kind of a witch. She was very mass attending, but had very unorthodox Catholic practices. So I'll leave it at that. And so, as when I was growing up, I sort of became a teenage atheist at like 12. I was very precocious for a child in that circumstance. I was hanging out at the library and stuff. So I like to read books on religion and mythology, and that's sort of what got me into my own religion. Because I will say that, in contrast with you, Kevin, I was not born a traditionalist. I was made a traditionalist via being an angry teenage trad before the internet. So, but that's sort of backing up. So when I started to read more about like, oh, Catholic Church. So I guess the catalyst was my grandmother died, my paternal grandmother, and the Mexican tradition is to have a novena of rosaries for your departed for over 9 days. So it was weird because I started to lead that, and I was, from a little book that I received for my first Holy Communion, and that sort of like said, oh, this Catholicism stuff, there's something to it. So I started to read books about it. But then I started to realize that what I was reading in the books and all these prayers was really contrasted to like what I saw every day on every Sunday, and I started to even go to daily mass. And it was just like, it's like this is not in the script. This is not in the script. So I started to realize that Catholicism had sort of changed very drastically. And my mother, even growing up, would tell me, "Oh yeah, mass was in Latin. When we were growing up, we didn't like it and things." So I read like Saint Louis de Montfort, Saint Alphonsus de Liguori, Saint Peter Julian Eymar. Like I started like try to like read Aquinas, although I was like 13 or whatever, and I
Yeah.
didn't really know what I was doing. So I very much, this was, like I said, it was very much before the age of the internet. So all you had was books. And I was in this isolated town with one church, one Catholic church, very liberal. And every single, all the horror story, liturgical abuses you could think of, we were committed. Like we sang "Lean on Me" at my from that, I guess,
Good
Bill
song.
Withers
Yeah.
song, like at my confirmation,
Okay.
things like that. So it was very much. So what happened was, after that, my mother actually started to get involved with the Legion of Mary again, which was sort of the holdout, traditional, conservative-ish. Um, and this is like the early 90s at this point. So the conservative-ish, faction within the church still. And I met this blind woman who was sort of the anchor of the Legion of Mary, and she she prayed the rosary, and she was very, very, I mean, I like to say that I don't really believe in God. I believe in people who believe in God.
I
And
kind of
so
like that.
she's sort of the one, her person, she's like the person who, when I think about that, I think about her and my grandparents who have all passed at this point. And, she was very compassionate, very, she was like 80 years old when I met her. And she was blind. She was living by herself. She walked every day by herself to church,
Wow.
about a mile,
Wow.
and she was blind. And so she was actually the one who got us to go to the first Latin Mass. Now, taking you back to the 90s, this was all before Summorum Pontificum, the Fraternity of St. Peter had only existed maybe, less than a half dozen years at that point. So the only way you were going to find a Latin Mass is we were going to get really lucky, or if you lived in a relatively large urban environment. So we ended up, Latin Mass was about 45 minutes from my house, and it was at 7:30 p.m.
Huh.
on a Saturday evening, and it was once a month, and that's the only all we got. So I probably went to my first Latin Mass when I was 13, and I didn't really fall in love with it at first because I didn't know what was going on. Like I'd never seen anything like that before. And but after a while, that sort of became the only mass that I would like commune at. Like I would sometimes still go to church, but I would go to church every Sunday. I stopped going to daily mass because it was such a mess. Like I didn't really care for it anymore. And then I started. That was sort of my only mass that I would go to, like to actually commune and stuff. And but after a while, my brother went away for to to college, and then I became sort of very lukewarm, typical teenage angst. And I sort of ended up losing the faith about after a few years of that. And then, I'd even like inquired because I had wanted to be a priest at that point. Like that was my dream. And yeah, I even had written away to the fraternity of St. Peter for, because for, what you would call it, like vocational information, and I was a subscriber to the Latin Mass magazine, if you've ever heard of that
Oh,
one.
yeah. Yeah.
And yeah, so I was a teen. I mean, I had that as a teenager, like I was a subscriber. So, but I eventually it all fell away, and I went to school at a school in California. You've heard of it. It's a major school, but I won't say which one. And so I went there. I actually ended up joining a very like left wing Marxist sect, if you will,
Huh. Wow. Okay.
kind of a cult. If I'm going to be very honest, so that's sort of the catalyst. Like I started as a young man. Like I didn't want to ever like, oh, I'm going to go to college and be a professional and earn a lot of money and stuff. It was always just like, how can I make the world better? How can I seek the truth? So I was in that for a couple of years, and then I was sort of lost faith in that as well. So I kind of was stranded at my college, but it was in a major city, so there was a Latin mass nearby. So I just thought I would just check that out once. And I even started praying the rosary. And this whole time when I was a Marxist, like I didn't believe in God, I was a militant atheist and things like that. And
So what made you pray the
so
rosary if you were like a relatively militant atheist
I
at the
just
time?
missed it,
Huh. Okay.
honestly. Anyway, there's the poem by Francis Thompson, Hound of Heaven, and I always feel like God's sort of been chasing me this whole time. But so I just had no, but I sort of realized in my heart that if I did go back to the church, it wouldn't just be like, oh, I'm gonna go on Sunday. Like it was gonna be something big. Like I would have to do something major.
Go
So
big or go home, kind
it,
of.
it was about a year and a half where I was just back and forth. Like I would attend mass by myself secretly and not tell anybody. And then, what it broke the straw that broke the camel's back wasn't like reading a book or doing anything. It was Mozart's Sparrow Mass, if you believe
Huh.
that. There was a mass, and it was at that point I'm like, you know what, I have to do something. So I ended up going to confession after what 3.5 years away from the church, and then within a year of that, no, not even, what would it have been, maybe 9 months of that, I just dropped out of college. And I had written the SSPX at that point, and the Society of St. Pius X. And they told me, you know what, if you want to be a priest and you want to get out of your situation, we'll figure something out for you. So, in about the turn of the century, I moved out. I dropped out of college. I moved into a Society of St. Pius X, a religious house. It was actually a retreat center in the mountains, and I lived there a whole year. And that was sort of what's called a lay oblate. So I learned how to serve mass, how to sing the mass, how to sing the offices, how to be a sacristan. I study a lot, so I became very, and within that context, I was going to go into seminary, and they announced on me, how do you feel like going to seminary in Argentina? And at first I was like, oh, well, that's not what I bargained for, but okay, because I was fluent in Spanish. So I ended up going to seminary in Argentina. I was actually there when the Twin Towers were attacked.
Wow. Okay.
So about the same year. What was that, 2000? Yeah, it was
2001.
2001.
Yeah.
And yeah, so I went to seminary in Argentina, and I would say that those are like, you're going to have those years, and you probably passed them already when you're a youth, and that's sort of like the golden years of your youth. So I've always had like very good memories of being there, even though it was hot, it was cold, they didn't have air conditioning. You were sort of at the mercy of the elements, and you were in a third world country. So but I survived it, and it was very edifying for me. But within the process of that, I should back up again because it gets a little complicated here. That I was sort of in with when I was before seminary, I was sort of investigating the Greek fathers of the church, and one of the priests was very much into like Orthodox liturgy and Orthodox iconography. And we even had a Russian Orthodox monk visit us as the SSPX, which was kind of weird.
Yeah, that is
But
a little weird.
so I was sort of had that bug, like I had been bitten by the Eastern liturgy bug. And while I was in seminary, I had a moment with my spiritual director, and he had told me, well, I don't think you're fit for an active ministry. I think you should look into a monastic vocation. So it was at that point, like I didn't leave seminary because I was thrown out. I didn't leave seminary because I was doing badly. It was just because my spiritual director said, you know what, I think you need to look into something else. So I left seminary, basically, I think it was like beginning of 2002 or something, by end of 2002. And I came back to the United States, and I ended up sort of putzing around a year. I had some things to tie up before to enter a monastery, but my confirmation sponsor, who I had known in my hometown, had become involved with a monastery, an Eastern Catholic monastery. I will not name uh, names just to not protect the guilty here. But he had become involved with an Eastern Catholic monastery, and I didn't disagree with the SSPX ecclesially. I just felt that there were certain aspects of the Eastern Orthodox liturgy that I felt more conducive to my spirituality, if you will, and I just felt an attachment to that. So I ended up, long story short, I was out a year. I ended up sort of discerning with that monastery. I ended up joining that monastery, and I was there for 2 years as a novice. It did not go well, and I left. And I actually changed rites. So technically, I'm actually a Greek Catholic, on the books anyway. I'm like I'm apostate, but I'm a Greek Catholic apostate apparently. So just to get our legal, I dot our legal I's and T's and whatever. And so I left my monastery, and at that point, I was just saying, you know what, I'm done. It's been 6 years of this roller coaster ride where I left school, like I left everything. I went to another continent. That didn't work out. I came back. I left everything again. I went to a monastery. It didn't work out. So I was sort of like the writings on the wall. This is it. I'm done. It was to the point that I actually sort of left the church at that point because there was a continuing. I don't know if you know what a continuing Anglican is.
No.
They're not the Episcopal Church. There's a sort of the conservative break off of them.
Okay, but
So they were actually,
they're Protestant. They are Anglican
yeah,
and
they would be Protestant. Yeah,
okay.
they would, they're not Anglo-Catholics. They
Okay.
actually are Protestant. They just have a very sort of high church ritual
Almost like
of
you almost
the
couldn't
Book
tell that
of
it's not a
Common
Catholic
Prayer.
mass kind of if you went. Like is that because I know some
Oh, well,
Anglicans.
there were differences, but it wasn't that high church. So
Okay, okay.
I ended up, they were actually, ironically enough, I mean, the diocese I grew up in was so liberal. They just let them meet in the old church where I grew up because the Catholic Church had moved across town. Like they had built a new church. So they said, you can have this our old church on Sunday morning. So I actually just ended up going to my old Catholic church, but it was an Anglican service. And it was actually more, it was ad orientem. It was very devout in its own way. And I
Okay.
was there for a few months. And then when I went to college, there was another continuing Anglican um, community, which was sort of a different jurisdiction. And I ended up going to that for a little bit. But after a while, I was like, you know what? There's not a lot to this, so I'm just going to become Catholic again and just be a normal person. So I ended up going back to the Catholic Church, and they had actually the same traditionalist mass that I had gone to in college, and I just ended up going there. And by that point, it was under the Institute of Christ the King,
Okay.
sovereign priest, and I ended up serving mass for him every day, Tuesday every Tuesday evening. And so I was doing that for a few months. And then I met my wife, and my wife does not like trads. And
I like your wife.
uh, yeah, she doesn't like trads. She actually, we actually, I should return because anyway, I won't get into her hangups and whatever. But we ended up putting together. My life sort of became normal. We ended up just going to regular churches until we moved back to down south to where she's from. And right before, as around the time we actually got married, I started singing in another Gregorian chant school. So she was okay going to that mass for some reason. Like the trads weren't that bad. It was like at 7 a.m. It was early. But at that point, I think I just had like a lot of issues. Like I was sort of done with the church, like in a lot of ways. Like it was nice. Like I liked the aesthetics. I liked everything in that sense. But I just had issues from my whole sort of intensive religious experience that I had not resolved. So once our first child came in, I mean, we baptized both of our kids, but we became very lackadaisical churchgoers, especially with young children. I mean, God bless trads who like wrestle with their kids every mass, but I was just not going to do
That was
that.
my
Like
parents.
if
Yeah.
like so if what they wrestled with you or they just
Oh yeah. I mean, uh,
yeah
I'm only one of four, which actually made us like a tiny, tiny family at our chapel.
yeah that's like nothing yeah.
Yeah, yeah, but so my cousins who lived a mile down the road from me. There's seven of them, and they weren't even unusual for that chapel. There was one family that had like 13 or 14 kids. The
Hmm.
average size was probably like six kids or something like that. Because
Yeah,
like
that sounds
we
about
had
right.
four, a few other families only had three or four, but most probably had you know, six or seven, and then I think the fours were balanced out by the 12s and stuff like that. So average was probably
Hmm.
like seven kids or something like that.
Yeah, my wife's family is was definitely Novus Ordo. They were just regular Catholics. I
Okay,
hate calling people Novus Ordo or trads or whatever. It's like, let's face it, like 99.9% of Catholics are a certain type of Catholic. So they're just normal, right? And
right.
trads are the weird one. So we don't have to like talk about Novus Ordo or whatever. It's like let's call this what it is. You're a special snowflake and you belong over here. So my wife comes from a very devout family. Like her mother's a third order Carmelite. My father-in-law is like a permanent deacon at one of the parishes here. So, but we were just very lackadaisical. Like I think I like to say that we were the last generation to be raised with the old ways, like as regular, like with us in the shadow of the old ways. Like our parents were like my mother in Mexico. I should tell this. I'll get back to my story in a minute, but my mother in Mexico, when she was in her village, like there was no other, it was just Catholic. And when she first came to this country, she would cross herself every time she passed the church, even if it wasn't Catholic, because she didn't know there was anything else other than not than Catholic. Like she just had no idea. Um, so it's very much, we. So I'm just saying this because even when we were, if my wife and I weren't necessarily very, you know, compelled to practice ourselves, the regions of the world we're from and our backgrounds and whatever, and the fact we had extremely pious grandmothers growing up, we sort of felt obligated to sort of keep up appearances, if you will.
I
So we would, I mean, we'd go to
understand
mass once in a
100%.
while. We would go to mass once. We definitely go to mass for Easter and but Easter and Christmas. But I mean, we with small kids, we didn't want to fight with them. Like we didn't want to do the WWE pew good competition that most kids do, and they're taking their kids in and out. So, but when the kids got older, there was a church about 45 minutes away, actually under my old Eastern Catholic jurisdiction. And I went there once just because I would take my kids out, just like the playgrounds to state parks to whatever. Like I would just take them out just to give because my wife works from home, so she needs a little bit of space, and so the kids wouldn't drive her crazy. And once I went to the church, this Eastern Catholic church, and it turned out like we had visited it before and it hadn't had a priest, and it turned out there was sort of like a little community here. So I'm like, huh, interesting. Let's go ahead and just check this out. And my wife came, and we ended up being part of that church for about 6 years. And my kids received the rest of the sacraments of that church, and so that was a church that they sort of quote unquote grew up in. And so they sort of grew up Eastern Catholic because I don't know if you know canon law. If one person is, they call it the sui generis church. So if one person, the children follow the sui generis church of the father, so they follow my church. So they're technically Eastern Catholics. So we were part of that, and we vibed with the priest. I think the priest was not a conventional conservative priest. He had a very interesting background. He was sort of very kind of like he knew like Daniel Berrigan. I don't know if you know that who that person is,
I don't think so.
like an anti-Catholic, anti-nuclear, pro-justice activist. So it's a very interesting mix of people. But around that, around basically last year, the kids were getting older, the priest had changed, the old priest had come in, another priest had come in, so we weren't feeling it, so we didn't feel invested to go back. So we've sort of not been, as a family, going to church together for that reason. And my kids have basically decided they don't want anything to do with it. So I just let my kids decide as tweens, well, do you want to continue as Catholic? And they're like, oh, not really. It's like, oh, okay, you don't have to. I mean, it wasn't like when I was growing up, and it's like you go to mass or else. We were very
Yes.
much a that generation. So I just let the kids decide, and I just pray for them. So the Hare Krishna thing. So during this whole time, I basically was at first atheist, and I was an agnostic. I've never really bought into the secular scientific discourse of what it says about itself, but that's a whole other conversation. So I was sort of just putzing around. Like I just went to church because my family did, and sure, I like ended up being the cantor at the church. Like I would help sing the service and stuff like that. I would serve at altar when needed, and we would actually were very involved in getting just the parish itself. And but I didn't feel particularly, I never received communion. I didn't, and it's funny, I've been to the Catholic Church, around the Catholic Church this whole time, and everybody knows this is I don't receive communion, but nobody has asked me why, which I'm sort of appreciative of, I guess. So I don't want to get into it, but I just don't. It's just a line I will not cross, kind of thing. And so during this whole time, I was sort of, my kids were getting older, and I was just around the church, but never of it. And but I sort of just missed praying. I missed. I just had that religious impulse. I guess if you were that pious, that young, it's sort of second nature to you. And the Hare Krishna thing was completely out of left field. Like I don't know if you know too much about how how it works. It's sort of, so
None.
I'll explain it. It's a monotheistic version of Hinduism, kind of like Hinduism's holy rollers. but
Okay.
the supreme deity, the supreme, we call Swayam Bhagavan, the supreme Godhead is Krishna, who is represented as a cowherd boy playing a flute, who usually has a cow with him. He has a main squeeze, I guess, to be a little bit sacrilegious about it. He has a girlfriend named Srimati Radharani, who's not married to, but he sort of sneaks around with. And so we believe that he's the supreme deity. He's Swayam Bhagavan, Ishvara Parama Krishna Sachidananda Vigraha. He's sort of the main deity. So basically, Hare Krishnas are known for one, singing in the streets and being very loud, two, giving out flowers and trying to sell you a book, and three, not eating meat, not eating. Basically, we have to like cook for ourselves all the time. So it's a very strict religion, if you will. So how did I get involved with it? Well, at the university where I was going to, there was a big presence of them. So, and I remember once, and this was when I was like complete an atheist. I was sitting in the main plaza at the school, and I was sick as a dog. I would probably had I just was always sick during. I always get the flu as a college student, and probably because I like worked in the cafeteria, so that was my job. And I just remember being sick as a dog. I had to go to class like in an hour, and I just was sitting in the sun. And I remember there was this one little guy. He was like a little guy. He wasn't dressed special or anything. He kind of looked like a Mexican like me. He sat down. He took out these little hand symbols. He just started chanting Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare. And he was just like with his little symbols. And I thought, wow, that's like, I found it very touching. And I always just remembered that. And just fast forward like years and years and years, when my wife and I were still living in California, I just had an inclination. Like I was studying all sorts of religions, and I was listening to all sorts. Like I've always liked Indian classical music, for example. And I just one day I just decided my wife was away visiting her parents, and I just decided to go to like the Hare Krishna temple one day. And I went in there, and I wasn't really impressed by it. Like I went in there during what they're called their Sunday feast, so they open up on Sunday and they feed everybody and they have a kirtan, which is basically they go around and they sing um, stuff in Sanskrit, but usually the Hare Krishna Maha Mantra. So when I say I'm a Hare Krishna, it's because I repeat 1,728 times a day the following mantra: Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Ram, Hare Ram, Ram Ram, Hare Hare. So I have to say it over and over and over again. But they all sing it communally. So people come, they sing, they dance, they feed everybody, and I was just sort of impressed with the temple. Like of course, as a Catholic, because I was sort of still Catholic at the point, I thought to myself, Omni di gentium demonia, all the gods of the nations are demons, right? So this is all demonic, blah, blah, blah. But it was like, but it's nice. So this is nice.
Nice, nice
And
demons.
but so I went, and I remember once I went to go see they built a new cathedral in a city next to me, and I went to go visit it. And it was so horrendous. Like it was just very modern. All the traditional stuff was relegated to like side exhibits. Like it just didn't feel like a church. So I remember after that, I just went to the Hare Krishna temple, and I just opened the door, and there was nothing, there was nobody there. The lights were out. They have what's called the deity door. The doors where the deities are. Like you couldn't even see them, and I just sat in there for like half an hour, and I was just like, you know what? I don't know. Being a Catholic is such a struggle because the way I learned about it in books and the way I fell in love with it as a young man isn't the way it is when you walk into any given church on any given Sunday. It's like completely different. It just has a completely different vibe, a completely different experience. And it's just like, I don't know why I even bother at this point. But I mean, I hung on for a few more years. But it was that angst that and eventually, about 4 or 5 years ago, I met online a guy who had been a Hare Krishna because there's a lot of disgruntled ones, just like there's a lot of disgruntled Catholics. And I'm not saying they don't have a reason to be disgruntled. I mean, everybody has a reason for their things. And I just started asking questions online, about it. And at a certain point, things came to a head in my own life where I had sort of a personal crisis that I will not get into. And I remember when he found out about it, he just told me, he said, you know what, chant Hare Krishna. And 20 years after I saw that guy on the plaza chanting, I just started chanting to myself, and I haven't stopped. And it's been like 4 years, and I don't have like I don't live net. I mean, I live near to a Hare Krishna temple, but not near enough to be able to go there frequently. It's just, I mean, I have 2 kids, I have a full-time job, it's very demanding. I have, a wife, and I have like all this stuff going on. And if you're going to switch religions, don't do it in the middle of your life, because it's going to be difficult. Like my head's full of Latin and Gregorian chant, and I have to sort of throw that all out and put in some Sanskrit and Bengali bhajans, and it's like it's very difficult. But so it's a very difficult thing, situation for me personally. But and I guess the reason why I went back to the mass that I'm seeing yet now, and the mass that I go, I mean, I hang out at that church, and the only reason I do it is because I really just out of the reason you're doing your channel is just to have a sense of community. And I do sort of vibe with it. I do believe in Jesus and the Virgin Mary and Saint Joseph and all the. I just don't believe in it the way you like a typical Catholic does. Like I have no problem playing the Hail Mary. I think the Hail Mary is a beautiful prayer. It's even more beautiful when you sing it in Latin. But it's just, I look at the theology. I just look at where the state of the church is and everything else. Like you know what? I just don't believe in this, because you asked me, well, you need to come back. You need to come home. You need to come back to Catholicism. I'll just like,
Come
well, which
home.
one? The Catholic Church of my grandparents, who are charismatic. The Catholic Church of my mom, who's just a normie who goes to mass every Sunday. The SSPX, who I have extremely good like memories of. I mean, I'm technically a Greek Catholic. I guess I should go back to that one technically. Should I go back to the Church of St. Pius X, who I read Pascendi when I was 18 or 19 or whatever, or should I go to the Church of Saint Francis? So you have to sort of define. Catholicism for me seems like it's a legal category, legal like a sign on the door. And it's like, well, what does it actually mean to be Catholic? Well, it means you go to the place with a sign on the door on it that says Catholic. But what does that actually mean? Like, and like I said, I'll go into any given regular mass on Sunday, and I don't feel anything. I don't like this. Like, if I'm having to go to funerals or weddings or whatever, it's like I don't feel that this is my religion. Like, because it's not what I signed up for,
Hmm.
if you will.
Yeah.
And I guess I'm sort of a rad trad in that sense, but I'm a rad trad who's become a apostate idolater. I've gone really like off the, you know, you go setting and then you go Hare Krishna, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I don't know if that's a
Um,
normal. I don't know if that's like the usual progression, but
well, I'll tell you, I'll share with you an anecdote, because I know you're not on social media, but this is sort of indicative of. And I do listen to your channel. I will say that a lot of the content isn't my cup of tea, because I don't really particularly care about like small apologetic questions like, well, who wrote the Gospels and stuff. I sort of care like, okay, you're trying to justify to me why the product is legitimate. Let me see the actual product of what you're selling. Let me see what it looks like right now today in any given spot. Like, don't tell me that it's bad for me to joke about McDonald's as a Hare Krishna because of how I feel about cows, but it's like you can't tell me that McDonald's is the best restaurant if there's no McDonald's. If the restaurant down the street is basically a horrible place. It is just doesn't have half the items. Is never open. The toilet's clogged up, and the staff is just going to yell at you. It's like because I feel like when people try to sell me the Catholic Church, still, it's like, well, you spend half the time online complaining about how the church is, and then you're trying to sell me into it. It feels
yeah,
like
they're
you're
selling
selling
an
me a Ponzi
idealized
scheme.
version of the church.
You're selling me like a Ponzi scheme. You
Yes.
just want me to get involved because I don't know if you just like misery and you think you'll be less miserable if you get me back involved in it. But let me give you a story. There was a guy, sort of the big social media blow up of the week if you will, was there was a priest who had been a Russian Orthodox priest who had gone to my monastery, incidentally, that I was part of, and didn't have a good experience either. And he ended up leaving, and he actually posted on social media. The only reason I know he didn't have a good experience is he had like a post with my old spiritual father on it, my old abbot, basically accusing him of being a sociopath.
Hmm.
And I will neither verify that or not verify it. I'll just say what it was. And then he ended up moving to another monastery, which I also visited, which was actually very weird as well. And after a year, he blooped altogether and he went off and became a Muslim, um,
Wow.
sort of like me. And I can I'll shoot you a link if you will. There's a lot of like stories on social media about it, but it was so interesting to see like the reaction of Catholics, like, oh my God, this is horrible. Oh my God, I'm gonna pray for him. Oh my God, it's like, why do you have to do that? Maybe he needs to do that. Like maybe, and that's sort of getting back to why I'm a Hare Krishna in a way that like I believe in like I said, it's I don't believe in God. I believe in those who believe in God. Like I don't believe in those who I don't love God, or I will say I do not love God. I try to love those who love God because I don't know what that means in my own heart. Like I know my own problems, and I just think that certain that in my own system of belief, people just need the amount of time they need. Then they are where they are for a reason, and you can't tell people what they're doing is wrong. You have to just say, you know what, that's where you are, and I support you as much as possible, but I don't see it. And I think I didn't even get this from Hare Krishna. I got this from a Russian Orthodox monk. Yes, this was an elder. Was it elder? I forget which one. It was either Elder Sophrony or somebody. He said, you know what? If you want to convince people of what of what you of something, you can't tell them what they're doing wrong. You have to tell them what they're doing right. And for example, me to you, like I'm obviously not an agnostic. I believe in all sorts of crazy stuff. I mean, we could go for hours on all the crazy stuff. I believe reincarnation, God became a pig and dug the earth out of a cosmic ocean or whatever. But as an agnostic, I would just say, you know what? You're doing a good thing. I can see you're sincere. And I don't want you to convert to what I'm doing because ultimately, in the end, we say das and das and das. Like I am not your master. I'm the servant. We're all servants of God. We're all looking for God. We're all sort of impartial pieces of God trying to return to God. So, people are at different stages, and I think God gives you as much time as you need. You don't have to like freak out if somebody goes Muslim or somebody stops believing or somebody does this or somebody does that. Like God's more compassionate than you can ever think about. So my that was sort of my reaction to all these people freaking out about this priest apostatizing and becoming a Muslim. I'm like, good for him. Like, if that's where he needs to go right now, let him go.
Yeah.
You know, and
You know
and
what's
he
funny?
seems sincere and he's still looking. Yeah.
Yeah. You know what's funny is that the same people who will say things like all truth is God's truth are the same people who will freak out when somebody like leaves one religion for another.
Well,
And
yeah.
I used to be one of those people who freaks out. Like you know, if I found out that like an FSSP priest back when I was an FSSP Catholic like apostatized or something, I would have been one of those people who's like, I can't believe it. Like that priest seems so sincere. How could he be doing something like this? So that absolutely would have been me. But now on the other
Mm-hmm.
side, it's so weird to look back and be like, wait, but if all truth is God's truth, what's the big deal? Like this
Yeah.
guy, this whoever is apostatizing is just uh, follow. He's believing what he thinks is true, and he's disbelieving that which he thinks is false. What's the big deal?
Mhm.
So,
That's
yeah,
why it would be very hard for yeah. It would be very hard for me to be Catholic again because it's just even as a traditionalist, I just saw the amount of judgment of people,
yes,
and even if they're the most beautiful, they have to have the most beautiful heart and so charitable heart in the world. It's like what you believe mandates that you're a mean person. Do you realize that? Like what you believe mandates it. Like you have to be mean to these and it's just I just like I can't think that God is like that.
um,
I don't think God throws people in hell for all eternity just because they looked at something on their phone or they did something. It's like I just don't think that. Like,
There's
I do think that, if you do bad things, yeah, maybe you might have to suffer a reaction for it. But that's neither here. That doesn't really, that's not permanent. Like there's like how can you be like and Catholics, if you pin a Catholic and say ask a Catholic, well, would you send your child to hell? you know, no matter what they did, if they, no matter what they did, would you say, God, okay, Timmy, I raised you since you were a baby and I loved you and I nurtured you, but you did something and I'm going to throw you in a pit of fire for all eternity and I'm just going to walk away and never think about you again. It's like, would you ever do that? And
no,
I hope most
absolutely
parents would
not.
say no.
Yeah.
I would hope most parents would say no. It's like, well, why do you think God does that?
Right. And I've noticed
and
something.
they'll and they'll and they'll he and ha and they'll get uncomfortable and
Yep.
they'll do all this stuff and it's like and you're just like, you know what, either you're telling me you're better than God, so why should I even like
Yeah.
it's a sunk cost fallacy at what it is. It's
Yep.
like you're saying, this is my identity, this is who I am, and I have to support it no matter what. I have to double down on it no
Yep.
matter what. And unfortunately, this is a very hurtful ideology. And
Oh,
I have to
very.
say it because I mean the Hare Krishnas have done this too. So I will. Then we've had our own problems. We've had our own things with scandal and people getting abused and stuff. But this was sort of the thinking behind a clerical uh, uh, child abuse crisis. This is the exact same thing. It's like, well, we can't, Father's so holy, he couldn't possibly have done that. I can't live in a world where Father would do that, but he did it. And I do, like I said, I hang out with trads and I'll sit there in the sermon and I will just go to my happy place when he starts talking about hell, when he starts talking about sin, when he starts talking about, I mean, I believe in sin and hell and stuff, but it's not permanent. Like it's not something, it's just like, okay, well, you were speeding, you were doing 40 and a 25, so I'm giving you a ticket. It's like, oh no, I got a ticket. You got to figure something out. I know I've been talking a lot, so I don't know if you have
I have
questions
a
or
ton of
comments.
questions. I have a ton of questions.
Okay, and I know I've been talking like an hour, so go ahead. Let's do some
Okay.
questions.
And by the way, you're right. It's been like 55 minutes. If you ever need to go and I'm in the middle of a question, just cut me off and that's fine. Um,
No, I
but
got time.
cool. So my first question is actually less of a question and more of a just a comment and a point of agreement. Um, there's an expression. There's no hate like Christian love, and what is expressed by that is like, um, Christians will say like I love you, but in the same breath like you're going to hell. Um, and I've also
Hmm.
found something that's interesting. Uh, I've noticed as a Catholic apostate myself that, as hardcore Catholics who definitely have a eternal conscious torment model of hell belief, as they actually lose people who are close to them, as they have people close to them apostatize, they become
Hmm.
less hardcore about hell. Um, my
Hmm.
family super trad. I grew up with a very trad model of hell concept. I've noticed that it's not just my family, but I've noticed other people, like my friends' families, because I have friends who've also apostatized. Like it's just people are becoming more universalist as they
Hmm.
actually realize that they're getting impacted by it, which is kind of silly, right? Because it's not silly, but it is silly because you realize that this is entirely like an emotional thing for them because and I feel like trads will like to argue that they are super logical only. There's no emotion in my reasoning, and it's just Thomas Aquinas said so, so therefore there it is, eternal conscious torment. But then they have a son who apostatizes, and it's like, well, I don't know, maybe you're maybe universalism. You know what I mean? And it's like, all
Yeah,
right. I'm glad that
which is
you're
a
not
good
a moral
reaction.
monster, but
It's a Yeah, it's a good reaction, and I will just tell you, like, as in my own experience, like we have a very as Hare Krishnas, we have a very different idea of what it means to be religious in a certain, like we don't, it's more or less belief oriented. Well, we have crazy beliefs. I'll give it that. I won't deny that, but it's like just chant,
action
like if
oriented.
you encounter Hare Krishna, it's like well, take a book and read it. And if you don't like it, whatever. Or come to our temple and we'll feed you vegetarian food and you can, play the guitar or whatever, do whatever you want. Like you just hang out with us and vibe with us, or and they might give you a garland and stuff. And all of this stuff is because we think that, I guess we're so convinced of the truth, we don't need to argue with you about it. It's like there's almost a presupposition of like, you know what, you'll figure it out. Like and every single thing you do that steps closer to us, well, we're going to encourage you and then some, kind of thing. But in terms of just that sort of, I mean, there's two thoughts. With the traditionalist movement itself, people have to realize that all the bad things that happened that the traditionalists don't like happened under the old mass and the old religion.
Mm-hmm.
Like there's nothing, they're just trying to recover something that sort of didn't work. You know
Yes.
what I mean? It's like if you're trying to recreate the 1960s, well, you don't like what happened in the 1960s afterwards. So you realize that if you're sort of just producing, you're okay, you're not gonna take birth control, you're gonna be super good, you're gonna homeschool, you're gonna do all this stuff. So, you realize that most of your kids are probably just gonna apostatize, right? So they're just going to go their own way at some point because that's what happened in the 60s when they had the old mass, they had Catholic schools, and they had the nuns that beat you with rulers and stuff like that. Like
There
you're
was a
trying to
reason
create the
why Vatican
world.
II happened. There was a reason why
Yeah,
Vatican II happened.
right,
Like, yeah.
right. And in terms of just the donation part of it, the whole like, well, then becoming universalist, when people say, oh, well, you should become Catholic again, I'm like, well, what you believe is sort of what I already believe. Like you're coming closer to me. You're basically like you're dead, like you're saying, oh, little Timmy goes off and shacks up with his girlfriend and apostatizes. It's like, well, you're like, well, maybe God isn't what I thought, you know, he was after all. I'm like, exactly, he isn't. It's like, welcome to the club. You're a step closer to coming to my end of the, you're stepping over my end of the line,
Yeah.
So I don't know. So that would be my sort of
Yeah.
observation as
Yeah.
well.
I got kind of different. So this is my first like real question for you. Uh, you mentioned that you still. I think that you used the phrase like "I believe in Jesus," and then you said Mary and Joseph.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but then you also believe um, that God is Hare Krishna, right? So how
Who's
do
Krishna?
those?
Yeah.
So
Bhagavan.
sorry, Krishna. Yeah. How do those
Yeah.
two beliefs work together? Because they seem like incompatible to me. Like the guy who knows nothing about anything that's
Right.
not
Hinduism and stuff.
Catholicism. Yeah. So how are those two things compatible?
Well, this would get into a lot of the one sentence after is I believe Jesus is Shaktivesh avatar. And that doesn't mean anything because it's just a Sanskrit term. But I will back up and say that a lot of people have described Hare Krishnas as polymorphic monotheists. So we believe
Polymorphic
that
monotheists.
polymorphic monotheists.
Okay.
So what we would say is that there's an original God, Swayam Bhagavan, or what is it, Ishvara, anyway, there's a Sanskrit phrase for it, but the God has a unique original form. But after that, there's what we call emanations or avatars or descents of God, and these are infinite. These are like millions and millions and millions and millions and millions. So we have, there's, I don't know if you ever heard the Ramayana. It's an Indian epic of the Lord Ramachandra and stuff. It's a very popular thing. So we believe basically Krishna is like, you can think of Krishna as being Bob. Let's say Bob. So we have Bob, right? And Bob goes to the office and he's maybe assistant, maybe he's a vice president of the company, right? So some people know Bob as the guy in his wife knows, Bob's wife knows Bob a certain way. Bob's children know Bob a certain way. The people at work know Bob another way. The people at Bob's bowling club know Bob another way, and they may even call him maybe he's called Knuckles because by his bowling people, and that's because I don't know, he's not very good bowler or whatever.
Sure.
At his work, people know him as something else. Maybe they know him as Mr. Samuelson or something. And then when he goes on the street, Bob is another way. So has very different aspects of his personality. And people know Bob differently. And people might think, Bob's a crazy party animal who likes karaoke. And the people at the karaoke bar know him as another way. So that's how we sort of conceive of God. That God, Krishna, so we believe Krishna has a body, Krishna has a proper name, Krishna has whatever. But the way other people know Bob or Krishna is different depending on what they're doing, how they feel, what they what their position in life is, where they are. And so basically I believe that's how you Christians, like I think, like I have nothing against Catholics being Catholics. Like if that's where they are at right now, and that's how they believe God is. Like I said, there are certain aspects of their beliefs that I would say, you know what, you should probably look into that because that's kind of weird. I mean, the big one is like vegetarianism, but I won't get into that hobby horse. But so the technical term Shakti Shavatar means that it's a descent of God who's sort of like a guy on a mission, right? So Bob has friends and God sends his friends like Jesus, let's say, or like Jesus, like Bob sent Jesus to the world to do a certain thing, to accomplish a certain amount of tasks. And he's going to accomplish that task according to where people are at the time. Like he's not going to go into some place, some society, and start saying crazy things that society doesn't understand. He's going to talk in their language, according to their customs, according to their beliefs. So I do believe Jesus is a representative of God. He's an empowered soul of
Do
God,
you think
and
that
we would
Jesus is God, or do you think that Jesus was
no.
a okay? So Jesus was a
That's what
man who may have like at some level been sent by God or something like that.
Well, it's like the Jivatma. We would say he's a Jivatma, like he's a soul like you and me. But like if you think about it, like in the Gospels, when John the Baptist baptizes Jesus and the Holy Spirit descends on him, that's sort of like that's sort of like the Arian
Oh
Christology, if you will,
no,
if you go
yeah.
back into the early church.
Mm-hmm.
But that's how we would sort of think of it. Like
And,
we would say that he was an empowered, but the way we would say it, so to back up, to just say, okay, it's kind of a different, this is sort of where the analogy breaks down, but we would say that in order to go back to God, to our home, back to Godhead, we would say, we need what's called a spiritual master. We need somebody to guide us there. And that's where, so the ones that we Hare Krishnas in the West, we attributed to A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada. So if I say Srila Prabhupada, this is the person. So he's our Acharya. So he's the one who comes and gets us out of the mess we're in. So we need a guide. So I believe Jesus is a guide for Christians to get back to improve themselves in their spiritual path,
okay.
if you will. But we would say that the spiritual, the acharya, the guru, is as good as God. He's not God, but he's as good as God. You can sort of even worship him as God, but he's not God. It's like he's like his representative, and we would say that. And Krishna says somewhere, and I don't even know where he says it, but I've heard it several times quoted, and it's in our scriptures. It says that he who is my devotee, he's talking as God, he who says he's my devotee is not my devotee. But he who says he's the devotee of my devotee, the spiritual master, is my devotee. So it's not just like God's in the
Hmm.
monotheistic sense, like with Muslims and Christians. Oh, God's obsessed with you worshiping Him alone. He's like, you know what? If you vibe with me, you're going to vibe with my friends too. So if you any honor you give to my friends, you're giving to me as well. So I can worship Jesus almost as much as a Christian. Do I think he created the universe? No, maybe. That's like a maybe question. Like, well, it depends. Who was he in a previous life? Was he Brahma? Was he what? It gets very complicated at that point. But it's
Sure.
like, can I treat him as God? It's like, sure.
Close
Like
enough, kind
he's
of.
one of my gurus. I treat him as one of my gurus. I worship him as one of the people. I mean, I know. So the way I found your channel was I was looking at another. You were on a stream of people talking about the Chosen, right? And I
Yes.
was that television series. I'll have to say I've cried several times watching
I haven't seen it
And
yet, but I want to.
yeah, yeah, but I'm an emotional mess anyway. But the way I feel like it's such a it's not a great series, but it has such like beautiful moments where you just see yourself there, and you're just like, because I can hear the words of Jesus. It's like that's the word of God. He's talking through that, and maybe he's saying there's nothing in the Sermon on the Mount that I would disagree with. Like there's nothing with I know I and in my own I do some writing usually for other Hare Krishnas and some I did do have a blog and stuff, but I won't advertise it here. Where I will talk because it's sort of the language I know. Like I lived 4 decades as a Catholic, so in approaching Hare Krishna scripture, which I sort of been, you know, um, sort of very, studying these past 4 years or 5 years, it's just like this is how I engage with it. So I have to use the toolbox that I have to engage with it. So I guess that's what answers your question. Like I revere him as one of the spiritual masters in my own life. And I do feel his presence, and also the presence of the Virgin Mary, and also Saint Joseph, just because he was a father
Hmm.
of Jesus on the earth, and like, I'm a father, so I you know had to invoke him several times as well.
Yeah. And let me tell you how far I agree with you, but then also where it stops for me. Um,
Hmm.
so I'll agree that there is a ton of ancient wisdom in the Bible. I think that
Hmm.
the Bible became the best-selling book of all time for a legitimate reason. I think that it was beneficial for society to have this Bible around, and I think that there was a lot of good stuff in there. Now, I don't think that it was all good stuff. And as an
Yeah.
agnostic, I don't actually worship. I don't worship. Well, I don't worship any gods really. Um,
Right.
but I do think that there's a lot of ancient wisdom in the Bible, and I would probably think that there's a lot of ancient wisdom in like Sanskrit writings. I haven't really looked into
Hmm.
them at all yet, and I've often said that you could spend your whole life just exploring Catholicism and not have explored all of it, and then you're going to run out of time because that's all the time in one lifetime. Um, so
Yeah.
um, I've kind of made Catholicism my pet project just because that's for no other reason than that's what I was born into, which is perhaps unfair to like any non-Catholic religion, but that's where I find myself. So that leads me to my next question, though. Um, I sometimes refer to myself as a cultural Catholic. I think that you maybe refer to yourself as like a cultural Catholic, but then maybe even more than that because your belief system almost like envelops Catholicism. Um,
Hmm.
Now, when I say something like cultural Catholic, what I mean is that I will still hum like high mass Gregorian chant hymns. I freaked my wife out over like a couple months ago, like around Christmas, because I started singing Gaudete, like
Hmm.
Gaudete, Gaudete, Christus es natus ex Maria Virgine Gaudete. I don't know if you know that one, but
Yeah.
uh, and I like that music. I think music is cool. I like all that like traditional Catholic music. Um, and that's kind of all that I mean. Like it's not deeper for me when I say that I'm a cultural Catholic, but I will argue that I think that religion is a useful tool for social cohesion. I think that religion is actually like a good thing for society because it causes people to come together once a week. Like, and in an increasingly fractured society, I think having some kind of like universal religion that like brought everybody together and actually like made you interact with your neighbors would actually be net good for society. I can see some kind of like I can look at your understanding of like, and I'm gonna use this phrase wrong, but like Hare Krishnaism. Um, I
Hmm.
I can see that being a tool for social cohesion in like a really unifying way that I think would be super beneficial for society. But I imagine that you see it as something more than just that. So I'm interested to hear you
Yeah.
say something to the effect of like, so um, how true do you think like Hare Krishnaism is, in as much as like, do you think that it's metaphorically true, or do you think that it's like truer in like a more empirical way? Do you separate the two? I'm interested to get your thoughts on all that.
Gosh, you'd almost need another hour and a
That's
half for
that's
this
fair. If
hour for
if
this.
you want to
But
take a rain
I
check
will
on this
say,
question, we can take a rain check on this
yeah,
question if you want.
no, I'll answer it to a certain extent.
Okay.
So, first of all, in terms of Catholicism, one of our beliefs is that we believe there's a phrase in Sanskrit is Vadati tat tatamidash tatpamiyaj ganamatayan brahmati paramatiti bhagavaniti sabdyate, which is the 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 transcendentalist, the person who's looking at for the absolute truth, sees the supreme reality in three forms: Brahman, Paramatman, Bhagavan. Which is Brahman is, I don't know if you've read like Meister Eckhart or like the real like if you've done like New Age stuff and when people are saying
Not
everything's
much.
one, we're all one, stuff like that, that is Brahman.
Okay.
Paramatma is so God is sort of without in Brahman, God is without the absolute reality is without qualities. It's like this big amorphous like negation of everything. It's just is what it is. You can't say anything of it. It's sort of the complete, oneness of everything and stuff. Paramatma is when the eminence. So it's the absolute transcendence, and then you have the immanence within everything of the supreme reality or Bhagavan or Brahman and everything. So we believe that when God creates, in quotes, because it's not a really good way to phrase it, when he creates everything, he enters every single atom. So God is present so in every single atom of existence. And so we would say so there's no separation between God, there's no fall, properly speaking, in our again, this is going into like the Dantic metaphysics. So this is a very, very rough sketch. There's no fall, there's no absolute separation between God and the soul. It's just really an issue of realizing this supreme reality that God is everywhere and everything, and that He sits in your heart and He's guiding you. And there's an image in the Upanishads, which is a commentary on the Vedas, which is a very old text. It says that there are two birds sitting on a branch. One is singing and enjoying, and the other is just observing. And this is supposed to say that basically you as a spirit soul proceeding from body to body to body who was never created, who was sort of basically a wayward piece of God, if you will, like a spark flying from the fire, into the darkness, but never quite going out. And that God is there observing you, and He's always with you. He's sitting in your heart. And so when I think of Catholicism, I think of, you know what, this is not entirely true. There's some stuff they get extremely wrong. But as God guiding them, as they're sincere, if they are seeking the love of God and seeking to be humble and seeking to serve and seeking to make things better for those around them. Although I wouldn't, that's a little too humanistic for me. But as they're seeking love of God, as they're seeking love to be that expression of God's love in the world, that God is guiding them to a certain extent. And so when I read, Saint Teresa of Avila, or I read, these mystics in Catholicism, I don't read them as, oh, they were part of this church and they got baptized and they got, communion and they were under this bishop and whatever. It was more just like they were experiencing God in a certain way, and they were expressing it as sincerely as they have, they could for the benefit of others. And we will say, I'll say in terms of truth, we don't really think of God like the absolute experience of God. We will not say that God is love. We don't say God is truth. We say God is rasa, which is rasa is like the Sanskrit word for like taste. So
Taste?
basically, so or mellow or something. So I would say God is not love. God is not truth. God is a vibe, if you will. So to be very like like zoomer about it. God is literally a vibe, and first of all, I just wouldn't trust, like, once somebody asks Srila Prabhupada or Acharya, it's like, well, there's all this crazy stuff in the Puranas about, the earth going around, the sun going around the earth and blah, 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 blah. And he said, it's just not in my experience. He said, what is your experience? Your experience is nothing. He said it was very dismissive, but at the same time, it's not. This, I'm not going to say don't trust your experience, don't trust your learning or whatever. But in my sense, it's just like, you know what? Is that it really that important kind of thing? Like how I don't. So the way I would phrase it is we're given 80 years on this earth if we're lucky. We're given a certain amount. We're put in a certain time and place in this lifetime to figure everything out. And with where science is and where technology is and where history and ideology are, social and political ideology are, you're in a very, very slim time frame. And to say, well, I'm going to trust what all the tools that I've been given, and it's going to give me the truth, and this is what it is, and this is the absolute truth. I'm not saying you're saying this, but I know a lot of agnostics and very like Dawkins, Richard Dawkins, and people almost give off this vibe. It's like, you're a very small speck in a very large cosmos living for a very brief period of time. So you can either choose to what you're going to choose to believe or not is sort of like, yeah, it's the best you can do, but it's not necessarily the end all and be all of what's out there. And I always say that I believe in, I've just seen some really weird stuff, I guess. Like I've seen just weird interventions in my own life that I could not explain. And you say, well, do you think it's true? And it's like, well, I'm just as much in the dark as you are because I'm going with the same limited five senses and the same ideology in the same country in the same century as you are. But I'm sort of choosing to go another way, take another path. And I will say that it's not an issue of me arguing about your beliefs. And I don't know, this might be off on a tangent, but I don't know if you've heard of the philosopher Pierre Hadot.
I don't think
He
so.
was a French philosopher. I would encourage you. I think you might get something out of it. He wrote a bunch of books. One is called Philosophy as a Way of Life and What is Ancient Philosophy. And he's going back to the roots. It's actually interesting because he was an apostate too. He was an apostate priest, if you'll think about it.
Huh.
He left
I like
Greece
him
in the
already.
1950s. Yeah, and he never went back to the church, but he became a scholar of ancient texts, particularly the Greco-Roman world. So he
Like the
wrote a really
Stoics
good
and
book on
stuff,
Plotinus.
or
Yeah, he wrote a book on Marcus Aurelius, which is really good, called The
very
Inner
cool.
Citadel. The Inner Citadel. It's very set. It's not doesn't have anything about God in it. It's just very like trying to approach them. But from a scholarly perspective, but he was sort of more than a scholar. He was trying to be sort of a not a sceptic, but he thought that the way philosophy had formed in at its beginning was that it was supposed to be a way of life. It was supposed to be a way of inner transformation, to self-realize yourself and achieve real happiness. And so there was the four divisions of the four schools are the Platonic, the Peripatetic or the Aristotelian, the Stoic, and the Epicurean, and there was also the Cynic. So I mean, if you know Diogenes, he has a special place in my heart. But his idea was that it wasn't they weren't arguing about doctrines and dogmas and trying to get to the truth. They were trying to live the truth. So it wasn't just a matter of like, oh, I read a book by Aristotle and I thought some of it was interesting and I argue with it about it with my friends. It was more just you had to actually go to the Aristotelian school and you lived a certain way. And you had and that formed your worldview to a certain way, that you saw the world in a certain way. And by that you sort of started to realize things. You started to see the world from that perspective because you got up at a certain time, you did certain practices, you did all that. So this is very much the way Indian religion works as well. That you belong to certain sampradayas, they're called, or certain schools. And mine is called the Gaudiya. What was it? Brahma Gaudiya. No, Brahma Magga Gaudiya Sampradaya. So we have an entire school of practices that we're supposed to do. It's like, well, if we're really going to talk about something, if you're really going to explore what I believe, you have to sort of live how I live in a certain way. And this was sort of how philosophy started. So I would just encourage that sort of thing with people if they haven't heard of this path before. It's like, okay, you're an agnostic. So were the Stoics, so were the Plato, so were the Aristotelians. It would be interesting. Hadot, Pierre Hadot. So he's a very when you approach truth, it's like that's why sort of internet blood sports if on YouTube they don't really appeal to me because like okay, you're going to tell me a bunch of things about Catholics. The Catholics are going to argue with the Calvinists, and the Calvinists are going to argue with the atheists. It's like you don't even live life. You don't even see things the same way. You're not even really going for the same things. So I don't know if that answers your question. It's like, well, do I believe it's true? Well, I'm living it and it's sort of working out for me, I guess I would say.
That's fair enough. Yeah.
Yeah.
I will say that I get a similar response sometimes when I talk to like non-Catholic Christians. Um, they'll say something like, "Well, you just have to like live the Protestant lifestyle, and then you'll suddenly see the Holy Ghost will come upon you." Um,
Yeah.
and um, my response to that is kind of like, "Well, okay." Um, I'm skeptical of that approach in general, and the reason I say that is because um, I think that that argumentation is, and I'm not saying it's less for Eastern religions. This is my response is more geared towards like any kind of Christian who says you just have to live it and see. I think of that as like a
Yeah.
little bit dishonest, and the reason I'm going to call it dishonest is because this same Christian tradition is built very much so upon like, well, you can use natural theology, and you can like deduce that like monotheism is correct, or like you can use normal like empirical methods to take a look at the Bible and figure out that Jesus really did rise from the dead. Like the most rational thing that you can do is become Christian because of the Bible. And so like when I see these people and then they turn around and tell me, no, you just got to live it. I'm like, well, which one is it? Right? It's one or the other, right? It's not either. Well, you just have to live it and see, or like, and also, no, you don't have to live it and see. There's evidence for this. Um, so I get like a little skeptical when somebody tries both. Like they try the one empirical approach, and I push back on the empirical approach, and then they say, "Well, just live it and see." And I'm like, "Well, was that your backup plan?" But I do feel like the Eastern religions sometimes they don't go the empirical route at all. They're just like, "No, just live it and see." And so I'm a little bit more like I guess sympathetic to that approach if that's like your first approach instead of like the well, I'm going to prove it to you using apologetics. I feel like Eastern religions don't use apologetics as much, and it's like am I being accurate here, or what do you
Well,
think?
we do, and there are certain devotees in ISKCON, the International Society of Krishna Consciousness, which is a technical term for the Hare Krishna movement, who sort of are into that apologetics vein. I'm less so.
Okay.
Like I'm not going to like I would say if you are interested at all in reading what I want to read, I would read like Bhaktivedanta Swami's Srila Prabhupada's Bhagavad Gita. I mean, it's good to just have know the Bhagavad Gita because it's like the major work of Hinduism. It's like the Gospels of Hinduism. It's like if
Yeah,
you
I mean,
just knew that,
I want
whatever.
to read the Bhagavad
But
Gita just because it's like one of the most ancient texts of the human species, and I think
right,
like from a humanist perspective, it's like a book that I should read.
right,
I haven't gotten to it
yeah,
yet,
yeah.
but
The way it was put to me when I first became Hare Krishna, it's like, well, you just do it, and whatever you do, you don't lose in the next life. So we just believe in reincarnation, right? We believe that we've been that part of us, not us entirely, but there's like a little section of us called the Jivatma, which is tiny, minuscule. You're never going to see it. That goes from body to body to body to body. So we believe that this has been happening since time and eternal. But they say that it was told to me that you know what, if it doesn't work out in this life, you'll have the next life. So and they say whatever you do in this life in terms of bhakti, which is the practice of love of God, is not going to expire in the next life. So it's like getting a token that never goes away. So it's like so if you come to a temple, you look around, you just you eat the food and you leave and you never come back. we're excited about that. We're just like, great, good for you. That's one step in our direction. Great. But we're patient. We'll wait for as long as you need to do that.
We've got
As
as
long
many
as you need,
lifetimes as
it's
it
just going to
takes.
be, yeah, it's just whatever. And I think in the structure of Indian religion, just because Hinduism, as popularly told, it's like we've always had pluralism. There's always been, even within our own, what we would call Vaishnavism, which is our worship of the god Vishnu, or as Vishnu as a supreme deity. I can't tell certain other practitioners and certain other aligned schools, hey, you're wrong because you believe this, that, and the other. It's like, you know what? You believe Narayan is the name of the supreme Svayam Bhagavan, the first emanation. You believe that? I can't tell you you're wrong because that's quote unquote your truth. But in that case, I cannot tell them that oh well, Krishna is better because of this, that, and the other. I mean, we have those arguments, but we tend to you tend to be good neighbors to other people who believe in different things just because the Vedic system in India, it's like there's such divergent schools interpreting the same text in radically different ways. At the end of the day, it's like, well, at least you're reading the text. You came away with a different interpretation. Oh, fine. You know, whatever. You do what you do, and it's actually a sin for us. It's actually one of the biggest sins for us to go in and start trashing other people who are, especially like seeking, God. It's seeking God in their own way. Um, so yeah, I mean, like I said, I'm sort of we sort of just have to cheerlead when people are come a step in our direction. And that's why I didn't right away say, oh, you got to read Srila Prabhupada's books, you got to do this, you got to do that. I'm like, you know what, with you, somebody like Hadot, somebody like reading something about Marcus Aurelius, that might help you. Like if you're looking for a practice in your own life, I don't know. I mean, this might be your practice. I don't know. I'm just shooting from the hip here, I guess. I know we're coming on. Maybe we can wrap maybe one or two more questions and then maybe wrap it up. I don't know
Tell you what, I
if
actually
you
think that
want
was a
to.
really good point to end on. I'll
Okay,
add
great.
I'll add that I actually do have Marcus Aurelius on my to read list. I'm in the middle of like well, 5 different books right now. 4 of them are Catholic books. One of them is fiction. I read a lot of fiction. I like every night before bed I read at least one chapter of just whatever fiction book I'm on. Because I just like reading. But Aurelius is on my list. The Bhagavad Gita is on my list as well. And I will make a
Hmm.
commitment to you. So this lifetime is dedicated to Catholicism for the most part. Um, but if I have another life after this one, I'll dedicate it to the various Eastern religions, or maybe just deep dive on one, like one aspect of Hinduism or something. Next lifetime.
Sounds good. Sounds good.
Cool.
Like I said, God is patient.
Cool. Cool. I like that. And one final note to actually end on is that I'll say I think that if more people, especially the more traditional Catholics, had your perspective, I think that the world would be a better place.
Yeah, sure. I think it's we always say that one of the prayers that we have is was more humble than a tree, more tolerant than a tree, humbler than a blade of grass. And I have a lot of difficulties with that.
I like that.
But I guess I am obligated as a Hare Krishna to say chant Hare Krishna and be happy. And yeah, I mean that's sort of that would be my ending thought, if you will.
Awesome. Well, Anonymous, thank you so much for coming on. This has been Kevin O'Connor with Anonymous on Conversations with Ex Catholics. And until next time.
Haribo.